Hey guys, welcome back. Today we are talking about something that is absolutely massive. I'm talking about a nuclear level shockwave that just got dropped right in the middle of the world of psychiatry. This is not a small story. This is not a slow news day. This is a full-blown explosion. We all know that mental health is becoming a bigger and bigger focus, not just here in the United States, but all over the world. People are finally talking about depression, anxiety, trauma, and burnout in ways they never did before. And for a long time, medication, especially antidepressants like SSRIs, has been seen as a critical go-to option for millions of people dealing with these conditions. It's been the default, it's been the safe choice, it's been what doctors reach for first. But then, out of nowhere, U.S. Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. just pulled off a huge move. He launched a brand new policy aimed at encouraging doctors to actually help their patients stop taking antidepressants. Think about that for a second. A top U.S. government official is telling doctors to start walking people off the very drugs that have been prescribed to tens of millions of Americans. This is like tossing a giant boulder into a calm, deep pond. The waves are enormous, and here in the US, and even across the entire global mental health field, it's causing a massive storm that isn't going away anytime soon. On one side, you've got the US government's health department, specifically the Office of the Secretary, pushing for a more careful, more cautious way of prescribing these drugs. They're saying, hey, maybe we've gone too far, maybe we need to slow this down. You've got the American Psychiatric Association, the ultimate professional authority in this country for mental health, firing back with some serious, hard-hitting skepticism. They're not just raising eyebrows, they're raising hell. This clash between these two heavyweights has thrown everything about antidepressants right into the public spotlight. The real effectiveness of these drugs, the long-term pros and cons, and just how incredibly messy and complicated the process of stopping them can be. And the American people, you, me, our families, our friends, we're all watching. All right? So let's break this down. Point number one, the detonation, the spark. The moment this thing went off, this health secretary's new policy triggered a major earthquake inside the entire industry. And I mean, the whole thing from top to bottom, here's what went down. In May of 2026, literally just a few days before thousands of psychiatrists gathered in San Francisco for the American Psychiatric Association's annual meeting, Secretary Kennedy suddenly announced a series of new policies. Not a suggestion, not a gentle recommendation, a policy that means the government is putting its weight behind this. The core idea: to push doctors to more aggressively evaluate whether their patients actually need long-term medication, and then help those patients gradually reduce or even completely stop taking antidepressants and other psychiatric drugs. That's not a small ask. That's a fundamental shift in how American psychiatry has been operating for decades. And he did not hold back. He didn't soften the message. He didn't try to play nice. He flat out criticized current prescribing practices, saying there's a serious problem of over-medicalization in this country. His argument was blunt. A lot of patients start treatment without ever fully understanding that they could be stuck on these drugs for years or even decades. They have no idea how hard it is to quit, and they don't know the hidden risks lurking underneath. He basically said the system has been failing to tell people the truth. And here's the craziest part. He actually came out and said something that caused an absolute firestorm. He said, and I quote, "Heroin is easier to quit than antidepressants." Let that sink in for a moment. The U.S. Health Secretary, the highest health official in the country, just compared prescription antidepressants to heroin. And not just compared them. He said heroin is easier to quit. That is not a subtle comment. That is a Molotov cocktail thrown into a room full of psychiatrists. That one sentence alone lit a fuse at the conference. A lot of psychiatrists there were genuinely terrified that this kind of language coming from the very top of the U.S. government would mislead the public. What are they afraid of? They're afraid patients will get so scared that they'll refuse necessary treatment. They're afraid people who actually need these drugs will hear that soundbite and say, no thanks, I'm not touching that, or even worse, they'll just stop their meds cold turkey on their own, leading to a total relapse or an even more severe condition, hospitalization, self-harm, you name it. Right at that moment, the CEO of the American Psychiatric Association, Dr. Wells, gave a speech, and he stood his ground firmly. He didn't waver. He said, and I quote, "We will never support government interference in medical practice." Let me repeat that. We will never support government interference in medical practice. That's not a negotiation. That's a line in the sand. And right after he said that, the room exploded. The applause went on forever. People were standing. People were cheering. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was a roar. And that applause sent a very clear message. The entire field of psychiatry is feeling intense anxiety and serious pushback. Secretary Kennedy's policy was seen as nothing less than an invasion of professional expertise. These doctors were saying, we are the experts, not the politicians, not the health secretary, US, but here's the twist. And this is important. This isn't just pure opposition. It's not a simple good guys versus bad guys story. The same health department also invited the president of the APA to join an expert panel this coming July, the goal to actually create clinical guidelines for tapering off antidepressants. That means the government is asking the psychiatrists to help write the rule book. And for that, Dr. Wells welcomed it, calling it the start of a conversation. So what does this contradiction tell us beneath all the anger and fear? Even the professionals realize that current prescribing habits might need a serious second look. They're not saying everything is fine. They're not saying there's no problem. They're saying, don't force this from the top down. Let us do our jobs. But yeah, we probably need to talk about this. All right. Point number 2, the core of the debate. The heart of the matter, are these antidepressants a gift from heaven? Or are they just a crutch that people have become way too dependent on because depending on who you ask, you'll get completely opposite answers? Kennedy's policy has touched the most sensitive nerve in all of psychiatry. So let's look at both sides, and I mean really look at them. First, the pro-medication side, their evidence is solid. I'm not going to pretend it's not according to baseline data from 2026. About 16.6% of all US adults are currently taking an antidepressant. That's millions and millions of Americans. And countless clinical trials have confirmed that these drugs effectively improve symptoms for the majority of patients with major depression. That's not opinion, that's data. They're relatively safe enough that even general practitioners, not just psychiatrists, can prescribe them as a standard treatment. You don't need a specialist to hand you a prescription for an SSRI. Your family doctor can do it. One psychiatrist went so far as to say he calls these drugs the gift from heaven for psychiatry. His point is that the drugs are mature, they've been studied for decades, they're safe, the serious risks are low, and they have almost zero addictive potential, meaning you don't crave them like you would crave nicotine or opioids. Sure, patients know there can be side effects like sexual dysfunction and withdrawal symptoms when they try to stop. But he says it's worth it. Why? Because the improvement in daily function and overall quality of life is so much greater than those manageable downsides. So, in his view, until new treatments come along, restricting or stigmatizing these basic drugs could leave millions of people who rely on them to live normal lives completely stranded. And that's not just an inconvenience, that could cause a full-blown health crisis. More depression, more anxiety, more suicide attempts, that's what they're afraid of. But now let's flip the coin. Let's look at the other side, the people who oppose long-term, indiscriminate use of antidepressants. They also have a huge following, and their arguments are completely impossible to ignore. In fact, if you're being honest, some of these points are downright uncomfortable. First, effectiveness is actually up for debate. I know that sounds crazy because we've been told for years that these drugs are proven to work. But there's ongoing scientific discussion about how much they actually help, specifically how much better they are than a placebo. Some research suggests that only about 15% of people with major depression get a real, meaningful benefit beyond what a sugar pill gives. Let me say that again. 15%. What does that mean? It means for a significant number of patients, the vast majority actually, the drugs might not even be doing the real healing work. It might be the passage of time. It might be therapy. It might be just believing something is helping. That's not nothing. But it's not the miracle we've been sold. Second, the long-term consequences are a giant question mark. In real-world clinical practice, the median time someone stays on antidepressants can be as long as 5 years. 5 years of daily pills, but solid evidence on whether that long-term maintenance treatment is actually necessary or effective. It's really limited. There are no 20-year studies tracking every possible outcome. A lot of patients end up dependent on these drugs for years without ever really knowing the long-term risks, and that's a problem. Third, withdrawal can be brutal. I'm not exaggerating. It doesn't happen to everyone, but a significant number of people do go through severe, long-lasting withdrawal symptoms when they try to stop. anxiety that's worse than before they started, headaches that won't go away, sleep disorders that wreck their lives, and even something called PSSD, which is a persistent withdrawal syndrome that can drag on for months or even years. There are people on forums right now describing this as a waking nightmare. So where's the education and warning on this? Patient advocates have been shouting about this for a long time, and they feel like no one has been listening. Fourth, there's the issue of over-medication and polypharmacy. That's a fancy word for taking multiple psychiatric drugs at once. In clinical practice, especially in settings without good monitoring and support, some patients end up on 2, 3, or even 4 different psychiatric drugs at the same time. One for depression, one for anxiety, one for sleep. One for side effects from the first one, that increases the risk of dangerous drug interactions. It worsens the burden of side effects, and it makes it completely unclear which drug is actually helping, or if any of them are. Now, here's something interesting. Even some younger psychiatrists, people who grew up in the age of medication themselves, have personal experience with these downsides. They're not abstract theorists. They've seen this up close, and they're becoming a real force pushing for smarter, more rational prescribing. One Columbia University doctor was brutally honest. He said that doctors often hesitate to stop drugs because they're afraid. He gave an example. It's hard to tell which drug is actually working in a patient who's on 3 of them. Or they worry that a patient who has already improved might suddenly slide backward if they change anything. So they do nothing. They just keep refilling the prescription year after year. So what's the real question at the heart of this debate? Psychiatry has to balance 2 different kinds of wisdom. One is using science to provide effective treatment, doing the addition part without demonizing the tools and scaring away patients who need them. The other is knowing when to pull back, doing the subtraction part, watching out for the risk of turning medical practice into just routine maintenance and drug dependence. That's not easy, that's really hard. But that's the job, all right? Point number 3, we have to understand that stopping these drugs is nowhere near a simple decision. This is not like quitting caffeine or cutting back on sugar. This is serious. At this year's APA meeting, the word taper was everywhere. I mean, everywhere. That alone shows that even the professionals are starting to face this issue head on. But the professional consensus is crystal clear. Stopping antidepressants is an extremely complex medical decision. It's not something you or I can just decide to do one day and be fine. It's not a test of willpower. It's not about being tough. A proper professional tapering process has to consider at least 6 different layers. Let me walk you through them. Layer 1, shared decision making. This has to be a 2-way conversation between doctor and patient, forming a real treatment alliance. The doctor needs to explain why they're tapering or stopping, what the possible benefits and risks are, including symptom relapse and withdrawal effects, and what the expected timeline looks like. At the same time, the patient's fears, concerns, and expectations have to be respected and understood. It's not a lecture, it's a partnership. Layer 2, psychological adjustment. Stopping these drugs isn't just a physical change, it carries huge psychological weight. For a lot of patients, the medication represents safety, a shield against their darkest thoughts, or proof that they're healthy and in control. If you suddenly pull that away without enough communication, it can trigger intense anxiety, even something called the nocebo effect, where negative expectations create real negative outcomes. You can literally think yourself into feeling worse. Layer 3, a scientific tapering plan. This process has to be gradual. I'm talking very gradual. Typically, doctors recommend reducing the dose slowly over a period of weeks to months. For example, you might reduce by 5 to 10% of your current dose every week or every 2 weeks. You absolutely cannot just stop suddenly. That is a recipe for disaster, for severe withdrawal reactions that can land you in the emergency room. For patients who have been on high doses for a long time, this process can take much longer. Sometimes even years. Yes, years. Layer 4, individualized monitoring throughout the tapering process. You have to closely watch for withdrawal symptoms or the return of the original depression or anxiety. This is not a set it and forget it thing. You need check-ins, you need adjustments. If there are clear signs of distress, you should pause the reduction or even temporarily go back up to the previous dose. There's no shame in that. It's not failure, it's smart medicine. Layer 5, special populations. This is really important for elderly patients. You have to carefully evaluate things like anticholinergic side effects, which can cause confusion and falls and fall risk itself. Breaking a hip is no joke. For women of childbearing age, if they're taking a drug that carries a risk of birth defects, The decision to stop or switch drugs has to be especially cautious. Pregnant women and their doctors have to weigh risks very carefully. Layer 6, comprehensive support. Tapering should never be an isolated event. It should never happen in a vacuum. It needs to be combined with psychotherapy, actual talk therapy that gives you tools. It needs lifestyle adjustments, like regular exercise and mindfulness meditation. Things that build real resilience. It needs strong social support, family, friends, support groups through this kind of comprehensive approach. You help patients handle the challenges of tapering and build their resilience to future stress. Things like CBT for insomnia and relaxation training. These are excellent supporting tools, but they have to be there. You can't just take the pill away and say good luck. And finally, you need clear criteria for when to even consider tapering or stopping. So when should you think about it? For example, after a time-limited course of treatment, when the patient has been stable for a long time, no major episodes, no crisis, or when the drug has been used at a sufficient dose and duration but still isn't working. In which case, why keep taking it? Or when there are severe, intolerable side effects that are ruining the patient's quality of life. Or when there's a risky drug interaction with something else the patient needs to take. Or when the patient's treatment goals shift toward non-drug approaches, they want to try therapy, they want to try lifestyle changes, they want to see if they can manage without medication. So you see, the policy's original intention might be to push for a careful, honest reevaluation of the value of long-term medication, but whether it actually succeeds depends entirely on whether it's built on a solid foundation of science, respect for individual differences, and complete wraparound support, not just empty slogans and press releases. All right? Point number 4, let's talk about the demonization trap and rebuilding trust in treatment. Because this is where things get really personal for a lot of people behind all these accusations of demonizing drugs. And there are plenty of those accusations flying around. There's a long history of social misunderstanding and a very real burden on patients. A lot of people are genuinely terrified of antidepressants. They've heard stories, they've read things online. They're afraid the drugs will fry their brains or wreck their bodies or turn them into someone they don't recognize. But as some doctors point out, part of the problem is that anxious patients, especially early in treatment, can take normal, mild side effects, things like slight nausea for a few days or a little dizziness in the first week, and blow them up in their own minds into some kind of catastrophic, severe drug reaction. It's not that the side effects aren't real, it's that anxiety magnifies everything. This kind of misattribution is common early on. And it's exactly why doctors need to be patient and spend time educating and calming their patients. You can't just hand someone a prescription and shoo them out the door. Here's the reality. A huge amount of medical research shows that when used properly, antidepressants actually protect the brain. I'm not making this up. They promote the regrowth of nerve cells, a process called neurogenesis. And they prevent damage from chronic stress. So the idea that they're destroying your brain is exactly backwards. The key point is this. Safe does not mean no side effects. There's no such thing as a completely side effect-free drug. Not aspirin, not Tylenol, not antibiotics, nothing. The fact that the label lists all the low probability side effects, that's not a sign of danger. That's science and transparency. That's the FDA doing its job. It's so that you and your doctor know what could possibly happen, even if it's rare. The vast majority of common side effects, like nausea, dizziness, jitters, and temporary insomnia early on, are temporary and manageable. Your body adjusts. And for the side effects that do affect long-term willingness to stay on meds, like sexual dysfunction or weight gain, there are real strategies to deal with them, adjusting the dose downward, switching to a different drug in the same class, or adding behavioral interventions like exercise or diet changes. It's not a dead end. Patients need a realistic understanding of how these drugs work. They typically take 2 to 4 weeks to really kick in. That's normal, that's expected. Accepting that there might be a rocky transition period, a week or 2 of feeling weird, staying in close communication with your doctor, and putting both your hopes and your fears on the table. That is the foundation of a good treatment partnership. Without that, you're just guessing. All right, point number 5. We need a deeper, more forward-looking reflection. We have to move beyond this simplistic, either a way of thinking, take the drug or don't take it, good or bad, pro-med or anti-med. That's not how reality works. This whole debate isn't really about making a final judgment on whether antidepressants are good or bad. That's the wrong question. It's actually a deep, hard look at how our entire mental health care system operates in the United States. And it exposes at least 3 deep issues that we have to face. Honestly, first, what actually works besides drugs? This is the question that keeps coming up again and again. If you stop antidepressants, what are you going to replace them with? You can't just leave a hole. The answer points to a much broader treatment toolkit. Psychotherapy, especially cognitive behavioral therapy and interpersonal therapy, has been proven to work. The evidence is solid. Physical treatments like repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation, RTMS, give new options for tough treatment-resistant cases where nothing else has helped. But here's the problem here in the United States. In a lot of places, these alternatives are incredibly hard to get. Insurance doesn't pay enough, or it doesn't pay at all. There's a shortage of therapists, especially in rural areas where the wait times are insane, 3 months, 6 months a year, if you don't have reliable, accessible non-drug options. Then any policy that encourages people to stop their meds is like telling someone to tear their roof off and then not giving them an umbrella or a shelter. That's not reform. That's cruelty. Second, lack of time and follow-up. This is a huge structural problem in our current medical system, especially for primary care doctors who prescribe the majority of antidepressants. There's rarely enough time for deep, meaningful conversations. You get 15 minutes, maybe 20. That's not enough to map out a long-term treatment plan. And there's rarely any systematic tracking. You get a prescription. You come back in 3 months and the doctor asks, "How are you feeling?" That's not monitoring. That's a glance. That means when you start someone on medication, you don't fully discuss the long-term plan. And when it's time to stop, there's no professional guidance or monitoring. People are just left to figure it out on their own. And that's where horror stories come from. Third, the influence of money and society. We cannot ignore how capital shapes prescribing habits. This is America. Follow the money. In recent years, some drugs have been heavily marketed through telemedicine and social media platforms. Glossy ads, influencer sponsorships, hashtags like FinderLiving or FinderSitYourBrain, that blurs the line between real medical information and lifestyle content. It can subtly glamorize the drug while hiding the risks. On the other hand, and this is the other side of the coin, reduced social stigma around mental health. Easier access to prescriptions through telemedicine and real legitimate need have also driven a genuine increase in people seeking mental health help. More people are talking about anxiety and depression. More people want treatment. That's not a bad thing. The UK is a perfect example. Even after official warnings and guideline changes about over-medication, antidepressant use kept climbing because demand just stayed high. People wanted help. They still do. So here's our final conclusion. We need to move toward a more precise, more humane form of psychiatric care, not one extreme or the other. Not drugs for everyone and not drugs for no one, something smarter. Maybe one psychiatrist said it best. He said, and I'm quoting directly, "I don't know how common severe withdrawal is. But I do know that when it happens, it can be devastating. It might be rare, but we have to take it seriously because it can really burn you." That's the right attitude. Rare doesn't mean irrelevant. Uncommon doesn't mean unimportant. The goal of this debate is not for the pro-medication side to defeat the tapering side or the other way around. That's a food fight. That's not progress. The real goal should lead us toward a more mature, more detailed, and more humane way of practicing medicine. A way that can honestly admit that these drugs are both powerful and necessary, but also holds humility and caution about long-term use. A way that puts when to start and when to stop on equal footing. A system that respects patient autonomy, your right to choose, and offers real, diverse choices. Not just one path. Psychiatry won't advance by stubbornly defending a single method. That's not science, that's ideology. It advances by being able to look complexity straight in the eye, absorb tough, even uncomfortable criticism from the outside, including from people like RFK Jr., whether you like him or not, and commit to building a more complete, more personalized system of care. That might require stronger evidence, more research, more long-term studies. It might require doctors giving more of their time and having more open conversations, which means system changes, not just individual effort. And it definitely requires the whole system government, insurance, hospitals, clinics, to actually invest in diverse treatment options, therapy, TMS, lifestyle medicine, peer support. All of it, the final goal is simple: to give every single person who is suffering in silence, everyone out there watching who has struggled, who has wondered if the pills are helping or hurting, to give them the hope and healing that actually fits them. Not a one-size-fits-all answer, their answer, all right? That is everything for today's video. I know that was a long one, but this stuff matters. Thank you so much for sticking with me and for watching. As always, please do me a favor, smash that like button. Hit subscribe and share this channel with more friends. Seriously, it helps. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks, peace.